Welcome everyone to the Walter Rodney Seminar Series here at the BU African Studies Center. My name is Eric Schmidt. I'm the Assistant Director here. It's my pleasure to welcome David Frankfurter here from the BU Department of Religion. He holds the William Goodwin Aurelio Chair of the Appreciation of Scripture. He's a scholar of ancient Mediterranean religions with specialties in Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature, magical texts, popular religion, and Egypt in the Roman and late antique periods. His particular interests revolved around theoretical issues like the place of magic in religion, the relationship of religion and violence, the nature of Christianization, and the representation of evil in culture. He earned his BA in religion from Wesleyan University, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and the MA and PhD from Princeton University. Prior to joining us in 2010, he taught at the College of Charleston and the University of New Hampshire and held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Studies and the Radcliffe Institute. He's also secured research funding from organizations like the NEH and the Guggenheim Foundation. His numerous publications include Elijah in Upper Egypt, Religion in Roman Egypt, Assimilation and Resistance, and Evil Incarnate, Rumors and Demonic Conspiracy and Satanic Abuse in History, as well as the edited volume Pilgrimage and Holy Space in Late Antique Egypt. Both Religion in Egypt and Evil Incarnate won the American Academy of Religions Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion. In 2019, he also brought the multi-authored Guide to the Study of Ancient Magic to publication after over a decade of work on Brill. His articles have appeared in venues such as the Journal of Early Christian Studies, the Harvard Theological Review, the Journal of the History of Sexuality, and more. And he is the co-editor for the Brill series, Religions of the Greco-Roman World. His latest book, Christianizing Egypt, Syncretism and the Local Worlds in Late Antiquity on Princeton University Press, won the 2019 Philip Schaff Prize from the American Society of Church History.
Read one.
And we'll be hearing more about that work today. I'm going to share a link with you in the chat here in just a second for a handout, which is a timeline for the Christianization of Egypt. And then after Professor Frankfurter's talk, we'll have a chance for Q&A. You can either type questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or during the Q&A session, you can click to raise your hand and I will help moderate and call on you, and I'll be able to unmute you so you can speak. So please join me in welcoming Professor Frankfurter.
Okay. So the customary story of the Christianization of Egypt has long been that diverse gospel messages spread around Egypt during the 3rd century. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to the true faith in 324 of the Common Era. And then, under the guidance of bishops and the inspiration of monks, all the people accepted Christ and abandoned their heathen ways, except for a few scattered holdouts. The story is promoted in the early church histories, Eusebius, Rufinus, Sozomen, and modern overviews as well. Unfortunately, it does not reflect the evidence on the ground. The papyri, ritual manuals, material artifacts, local sermons, and saints' lives. My 2018 book, Christianizing Egypt, offered a different model, one that stressed syncretism, regional focus, and indigenous agency. Today, I offer you an overview of my different model for religious change. Sometime in about the 7th century, an Egyptian monk recorded 2 healing charms on either side of a piece of papyrus. At this point, the temples of Egypt were in ruins, silent enclosures for the occasional Christian chapel or private devotions. And for impressive architecture, one looked to the great saints' shrines, the churches with their colorful wall paintings, or the great estates outside the towns. Christianity and its images and leaders fairly permeated the culture of Egypt. The stories and songs that people shared revolved around the saints and the Holy Family. And so the first spell he took down and introduced with a series of holy titles to evoke church liturgy, told a story of Jesus and the apostles' encounter with a doe in labor, how the doe appealed to Jesus to help her through childbirth, and how Jesus sent the archangel Michael to ease the pain. But in the second charm, the monk shifted to another set of figures, whose story he continued on to the other side of the papyrus. I quote, Jesus Horus, the son of Isis, went upon a mountain in order to rest. He performed his music, set his nets, and captured a falcon, and ate it without salt on it. He had pain, and the area around his navel hurt him, and he wept with loud weeping, saying, today I am bringing my mother Isis to me. I want a messenger spirit so that I may send him to my mother Isis. The spirit went upon the mountain of Heliopolis and found his mother Isis wearing an iron crown and stoking a copper oven. Finally, Isis declares her magical blessing by her true name that the sun bears to the west and the moon bears to the east, and the spell concludes, let every sickness and every difficulty and every pain that is in the belly of this patient stop at this moment. I am the one who calls, the Lord Jesus is the one who grants healing. So sandwiched between invocations of Jesus as healer emerges an extensive narrative about the ancient Egyptian gods Horus and Isis, at a time when no temples and no priesthoods could anymore sustain their myths and rites, and when no one could still read the Egyptian texts where such traditional stories had been recorded. And yet this charm for abdominal pain and the four others like it for sleep, childbirth, erotic success replicate many of the basic features of Isis-Horus charms from many centuries earlier. As in the ancient Isis-Horus spells, which were meant for healing, this Coptic spell emphasizes the drama of Horus's suffering far from his mother Isis, the receptive, almost sing-song structure, and like the preceding legend of Jesus and the doe, its application to some specific real-world crisis. What is this text doing in Christian Egypt? What does it mean about Christianization, about abandoned rites and traditions, and about the folklore that might stretch between these two religious periods? Is it pagan or Christian to record or recite such spells? And what of the scribe, whose investment in the authority and magic of Christian ritual speech is shown from the very beginning of the document? How did he understand these ancient names? And how many others copied similar spells in monastic cells, at shrines, or in villages? These kinds of texts belong to a field of data that shows Christianity not as accepted or converted or coerced, but as combined, mixed, framed in Egyptian terms. Christian underworld descriptions, strikingly reminiscent of Egyptian mortuary texts. Folk practices that seem to belong neither to Christianity nor to the ancient temple religion in their institutional forms. Churches inside or next to temples. Even temples, right. Mater Lactan's images that seem to recall the goddess Isis with baby Horus. These kinds of materials seem to show the process of Christianization more closely than simplistic models of conversion or Christian triumph. They seem to reflect local worlds of representation and what Claude Lévi-Strauss called bricolage, the combination and recombination of symbols and images out of an effort to express larger truths. These kinds of mixed materials reflect Egyptian people's agency and active engagement with Christianity, not just allegiance to Christ, going to a church and getting the children baptized. It is the interpretation of these kinds of materials that I want to address this afternoon. These materials that seem to lie between Christianity and older religious traditions have classically been labeled pagan survivals, or as I prefer to put it, heathen survivals, to counter the idea that there was actually such a thing as paganism. Heathen refers to an invented and prior other, not an historically practiced religion. As heathen survivals, then, these mixed materials have been linked to all the many archaic seeming folk customs that have punctuated local Christianities from late antiquity through today. the ceremonial slaughter of animals for St. Felix in 5th century Italy, and the lighting of candles at crossroads in 6th century Iberia. A warrior dance for the Virgin Mary, painted in a 12th century Sudanese church, and agricultural spirit mediation in 14th century Friuli. Today, we still have Christmas trees and Easter eggs, Vaudou Loa and Candomblé Orishas as Catholic saints. What do these kinds of persisting traditions mean? The term heathen survival, in fact, proposes its own intrinsic narrative, that these traditions all belong to and have greater meaning in the ancient heathen religion, some putative, organized religion that predated Christianity. Following conversion or the decadence of ancient heathen cults, the story goes, these various practices remained as random superstitions or magic, or in the words of the antiquarian scholar Alphonse Barbe, the syncretistic rotting refuse heap of the dead and dying religions of the whole ancient world. Heathen survival implies both a heritage in a vague but historically prior religious system and a resilience, even in the form of superstition in the face of Christianity. The continuity of heathen survivals implies incomplete doctrinal instruction or lax missionizing, and certainly uncomprehending village folk. Indeed, picturing a Christian culture as rife with heathen survivals has long served as a kind of sanction for missionizing and reform. Protestant evangelists have often seen folk practices as evidence of an incomplete Christianity, a kind of whitewashed heathenism, and thus as warrant for evangelizing and exorcism. Catholic and Orthodox religious cultures have at one time or another all been historically regarded as thinly veneered heathenisms on account of practices, folk and official alike, that seemed unchristian. Today one often finds such criticism by evangelicals of dance and drumming styles in African Pentecostal churches as likewise heathen. But the rhetoric of survivals has also allowed a positive, even nationalist spin in the sense of authoritative cultural heritage. For modern Greeks and Irish, the strange festival practices of rural compatriots bespeak the transcendent power of cultural heritage. We are the sons of the Celts or the Achaeans. Likewise, for modern Copts, the apparent wealth of pharaonic imagery in early Christian art and architecture, which is vastly overstated, by the way, as with most such nostalgic efforts, demonstrates their proper inheritance of the glory of the pharaohs, so that even Coptic Christianity itself conveys that heritage instead of obliterating it. It is the Coptic Church, not Islam, that is, which conveys Egyptian heritage according to this perspective. So I've been focusing on the language and ideological narrative of the heathen survival, but much of what I've been discussing here pertains to another problematic term, syncretism. Once blithely used to describe the combination of elements from different religious traditions, syncretism has come under heavy fire in recent years. Why? Because like heathen survival, it often implies that the elements combined, or ostensibly combined, belong to pure and mutually exclusive religious systems, whether Egyptian and Greek or Christian and heathen, when in fact, all these alleged systems were endlessly mutating and shifting, bricolage taking place in many different regional and local contexts. My point here is not to launch some tedious crusade against all second-order terms, but simply that when we're dealing with this exceedingly interesting phenomenon, the combination of religious traditions, The terminology really does affect our interpretation, even tainting it ideologically. These uncritical assumptions have not simply dominated, but dictated the work of many historians, while anthropologists and to some extent historians of religion have achieved considerable nuance in rectifying the concept of syncretism. These fields have grown particularly attentive to how subjects and opponents each describe syncretistic phenomena and what the consequences of their different perspectives might be for the observer's interpretation. Is the survival, in fact, an ancient tradition or really a modern one? Do subjects consider it Christian? And what might non-Christian or heathen actually mean for one or another historical community in late antique Egypt or Gaul or modern Ghana? Indeed, the study of religious combinations and syncretistic phenomena in late antique Egypt, much as in modern Mexico or medieval Italy, involves not simply the haphazard collecting of things that seem archaic or superstitious, but examining how they are embedded in culture, serve as Christian media, or alternately how they are picked out of local culture by missionaries and reformers as heathen. On what basis, according to what models, memories, or even manuals for identifying heathenism? It makes a big difference historically and for insiders who identifies heathen survivals, whether for censure or for the sake of cultural heritage. Is it something the scholar performs on a culture that considers most ritual practices as Christian, as within the plausible spectrum of Christianity? Or is it the accusation of some bishop or monk trying to make sense of anomalies in some region's ritual practice? Or does this kind of classification, pagan survival, actually belong to the culture itself? Does recalling or labeling certain practices as heathen function the way some cultures label practices as sorcery or witchcraft, as an ethno-classification? Some anthropologists have adopted the term anti-syncretism to describe the last two circumstances I mentioned, in which insiders or quasi-insiders pick out certain practices as heathen or otherwise contaminating of an ostensibly pure religious system and allow other practices as legitimate. In contrast to anti-syncretism, syncretism itself would refer to the whole dynamic process of religious acculturation and bricolage as the anthropologist observes it or as the historian encounters it in sources. In this sense, there would be no religious transformation without syncretism. Let me give some examples from late antique Egypt. The fiery late 4th century Egyptian abbot Shenuti of Atrupe complains in one sermon about people lighting lamps to Shai, an Egyptian god of civic fortune. Woe to any man or woman who gives thanks to demons, saying that today is the worship of Shai, or Shai of the village, or Shai of the home, while burning lamps for empty things and offering incense in the name of phantoms. In another sermon, Shenuti complains about people going to Christian holy men for amulets made of fox claws, snake's heads, crocodile teeth, and magical water. While he does not explicitly label these practices as heathen or Hellene in the terms used then, he is still picking them out from the totality of religious culture as reprehensible anomalies to Christian practice. This discrimination in itself, this anti-syncretism, requires as much critical attention as the practices themselves. How does Shenuti or his audience imagine Christianity as exclusive of these practices? Anti-syncretism represents an historical, sometimes idiosyncratic, ideological current, often voiced against a prevailing tolerance in folk culture. Syncretism itself, however, is invariably not voiced or asserted in this way. It is usually something the historian or ethnographer notices and seeks to understand. As an interpreter of the dynamics of Christianization, I myself, for example, noticed the syncretism involved in a peculiar ritual that took place at some early Christian saint shrines in Egypt, where a visitor would deliver a question to the entombed saint written in the form of two possible answers. Questions ranged from whether to have a baby at home to whether to voice a complaint, as in this case. The shrine attendants would return the answer chosen by the saint, according to some hidden rite we cannot reconstruct. What is remarkable is that this ticket oracle procedure goes back over 1,000 years in Egyptian religion. In fact, it had really taken off in Egypt some 5 centuries before the Christian cults were in operation. Yet there are no records of the ticket oracle's censure as a heathen practice. Thus, when we study it as one particular feature of the overall process of Christianization and acculturation, rather than simply as a survival, this oracle practice could be described as a kind of syncretism. It becomes not a holdover from the age of the pharaohs, but a traditional Egyptian form of Christian practice, a kind of gesture basic to the region, part of the habitus or repertoire of communication at a holy site. I have now moved from the general issue of heathen survivals to the critical problem that syncretism poses to imagining Christianization in general in any simplistic sense. Syncretistic phenomena complicate most models of Christianization by showing that a culture integrating a new religious system will inevitably do so, not by spiritual need or some such romantic process, but through combination, localization, and bricolage, and often little sense of conflict in that combination. It is in this more dynamic sense, aware of its historical problems, that I believe we can maintain the category syncretism to refer both to religious synthesis and to the politics of authenticity in a given culture. I don't think we can get away from the old baggage by abandoning syncretism for, say, hybridity, which means something very different. Sometimes retooling old terms holds us accountable for their historical excesses. So when I use syncretism, I mean not some abstract convergence of pure traditions. I mean it rather to express 3 basic elements, basic dimensions in the transformation of religions: agency, gesture, and landscape. So first, attention to agency in syncretism has been probably the most important reorientation in recent years, for it truly brings us from abstract notions of religious merging into the sphere of practice and of creative experiment. We enter the world of real individuals in communities, proposing different media and different places for imagining a new religious system, what a prominent medievalist unfortunately called do-it-yourself Christianity. Likewise, attention to agency may illuminate those people who resolutely maintain or even revitalize older traditions against newer ones, what some historians call crypto-pagans. These are the individuals who keep traditional altars and observe festivals in secret while professing Christianity in some public way. These unusual cases, which late antique bishops often trotted out with immense annoyance, illustrate the very range of private efforts to engage a new religious system in the context of older traditions. Some people embraced the one by means of the other. Others saw alternative ritual fields between which they could oscillate. And others created secret traditions behind the closed doors of the domestic sphere. Each strategy demonstrates agency And by focusing on this idea, we allow syncretism to cover all the ways people act deliberately and creatively, choosing to maintain an ancestor shrine or burn it down, or add a cross to it, to participate in a pilgrimage to a local spring, erect a cross there, or privately leave offerings, even to mold crosses or female figurines or stamp cakes to sell at a festival. To the extent that syncretism involves an historical dimension, in the sense of tradition, of the preservation of practices and associations over time, we have to look at gestures as having the capacity to maintain traditions and attitudes. Gestures at festivals and on leaving the house, before a sick child and inside a shrine. How does someone know what to do at a sacred tree or healing shrine? How to approach a saint? How to react to a neighbor's unsafe word? Or how to dance at a festival? Gestures embody memory and local tradition. Gestures involve the individual in collective practice and the collective in religious institutions. Gestures like the Oron's hand position might distinguish a soul in transit, or signify communication with gods, or link oneself to an official image. Facility with gestures identifies one person as ritual authority and another as devotee. Communal gestures allow the perpetuation and adjustment of memories, like spirits of a pond, the power of an archaic image, or the necessity of some ritual for family prosperity. Much of the evidence we have for so-called heathen survivals, in fact, depicts popular gestures of response to places, times, and events. Martin of Braga in the 6th century complains that his baptized audiences in northwestern Iberia, that is Spain, still, quote, light candles beside rocks and beside trees and beside fountains and crossroads, set out tables and put up laurel leaves on Vulcan's day, pour fruit and wine on a log in the hearth, throw bread into a fountain, and so on. An anonymous source from 5th century Egypt likewise complains that people bathe their children in water from the arena or the theater and pour all over themselves water with incantations spoken over it, and break clay pots, claiming it repels the evil eye, and tie amulets on their children. We cannot attribute these practices to larger religious systems, ecclesiastical or heathen. Rather, they are gestures embedded in life and directed to places, times, events, and in the last case, children. Gestures that in this case, the speaker picks out as anomalous, but participants regard as necessary and congenial. These kinds of witnesses depict both gesture and also people's agency, even assertiveness in maintaining the gestures as part of the repertoire of safeguarding family members. But they also depict people negotiating new religious systems within particular landscapes: rocks, trees, fountains, urban sites like the arena. Other sources show people conceptualizing Christianity, its saints and powers, through particular mountains, rivers, marshes, boundaries, and even structures. We think with what surrounds us, with what we see, walk through, and steer away from. Social transition itself is invariably played out across territory, and dangers are invariably imagined according to pools, desert, swamp, and crossroads. Social scientists like the Africanist Sandra Green have long noted the capacity of landscape features to forbid or invite particular social groups, to symbolize liminality and center, to call for rites of passage and re-entry, and to conjure both memory and emotion. In his brilliant study of the Christianization of the Andes, Michael Salno noted that power itself was always spatial, mapped out across the variegated natural environment and thus appearing to issue from the landscape itself. In these ways, landscape serves as the fundamental context for religious authority. It is the primary medium for recalling gestures, encountering spirits, and conceptualizing religious systems. All three of these factors in syncretism, agency, gesture, and landscape, bring us into the practiced, lived world of people in space and time. And they also invite us into the particular social worlds in which people express agency, develop or maintain gestures, and act in the landscape. Social worlds like mothers and grandmothers, guilds and confraternities, craftsmen, monastic scribes, ritual experts, even pilgrims at shrines. All such social worlds, or what Theodore Shatsky called social sites, involve different configurations of activity and personal engagement, social bonding, social identity, and movement through fixed spaces. And consequently, in the course of the Christianization of a region, each social site will involve different motivations, attitudes, materials, and creative innovation in the area of religion. They are not just social sites, but religious laboratories. Creators of media, terracotta figurines, written amulets, may involve the most vivid forms of agency in the sense of deliberate creativity, while those who assert their demands on saint shrines and on ritual experts like pilgrims will contribute in other ways to the syncretistic construction of Christianity as audiences, tradents, and collective shapers of tradition. Both craftsmen and tradents comprise particular, if interconnected, social worlds. Thus, the problem of describing religious syncretism, indeed of locating the Christianization of Egypt or any culture, becomes one of identifying the individual social sites in which religious agency is expressed. Among the social sites most pertinent for the negotiation and construction of Christianity in Egypt, I have been most interested in the home, the saint shrine, the workshop, the holy man or ritual expert, and the literate specialist. Each receives a chapter in my book, Christianizing Egypt. Obviously, none of these social sites is entirely discrete. Each naturally extends outward to overlap with others. For example, as I will describe further, agents of the domestic sphere, the home, bring their needs and concerns to saints' shrines for resolution in vows or by oracles, while the saint shrine depends on workshops to produce images and amulets to commemorate devotees' visits, and on literate experts to develop legends for public reading. Yet individually, each site has its own distinctive needs, gestures, spatial parameters, and social contexts in which Christianity would be interpreted. The domestic sphere, for example, involves particular concern for the perpetuation of the family, for procreative fertility, for commemoration of ancestors, and for protection. Cross-culturally, the ritual gestures particular to the home and its concerns tend to be embedded in everyday gestures, from threshold crossing to hearth keeping, from hair combing to water fetching. Everything can be brought into ritual application. A saint's life from the 6th century, when the Christian institution held nominal power, describes a certain village in which they worship an idol called Kothos, which is mounted in the niches of their houses. And when they go inside their doors, they are accustomed to bow down their heads and worship him. This is a Christian scribe's view of domestic ritual in a village that had so far refused Christianization. The author portrays a niche altar, like here, the simple domestic image, and specific devotional gestures. Likewise, I quoted Abbot Shanuti earlier on, people celebrating the god Shai in his time, late 5th century, with lamps and greetings. Indeed, it is no surprise that most purist or anti-syncretist accusations of anomalous practices in early Christianity list gestures in and around the home, concerned with protection of family members and propitiation of spirits related to the home. But behind these occasional explosions of reform and purification of anti-syncretism, we can see the agency of the domestic sphere. It is this agency in the assertion of needs and gestural traditions that would be steering the use of figurines produced by late antique pottery workshops for the home or to deposit in graves or at shrines. These images provide the media for symbolizing and communicating procreative fertility and maternal safety between home and shrine, carrying a saint's promise or reminding an entombed ancestor of his family's needs. It is not a question of abiding goddesses, but of useful images, objects of ritual agency, and instruments of popular gesture. Given that many such images were manufactured, sold, and deposited in saint shrines like Apamena, southwest of Alexandria, we can see the extension of the domestic sphere and its ritual expressions through pilgrimage to the world of the shrine. In many ways, the home becomes a kind of axis of ritual agency, stimulating family members to go out, to prevail on shrines for protective water, oil, sand, amulets, and the such. Syncretism, as the historian and archaeologist find it here, comprises simple gestures, often local holy sites, crude images with not much more than a cross to indicate institutional participation, and an openness to the most eclectic bricolage of Christianity and folk tradition for the sake of family security. If traditional spirits are propitiated, as Abbot Shanuti describes with lamps lit for shy, it is rarely as cult and more often as a function of calendrical observance, protection, and ancestral commemoration. In most cases, syncretism occurs less through deliberate efforts to mix, and more often simply through articulating Christian power according to traditional media, from amulets to writing to terracotta figures. And these media of power also point to distinct social sites. The Christian magical texts that combine Christian and Egyptian names, such as I began this talk, point not to some amorphous heathen world of magic, but to literate experts in the collection, editing, and construction of magical spells for everyday crises. Still today, one finds such experts among the Debtera of the Ethiopian Church. Most of the social sites to which we can attribute syncretistic forms are distinctive for their explicit dedication to the production of Christian materials, texts and funerary stelae, figurines, lamps, and vials. Whether monks or craftsmen, they do not reflect some world of belief and representation in any way separate from the culture of Christianization. Syncretism is the vehicle for producing Christianity. It is in this regard that I want to turn finally to the saint shrine as a veritable crucible for lived Christianity and for the perpetuation of traditional religious forms. Saint shrines served as regional religious centers for villagers and townspeople, agents of the domestic sphere, and they served as sites of creativity in ritual and craft. The saint shrine enveloped workshops, bishops and other ecclesiastical performers, devotees, monks, and literate experts. The central function of the saint's shrine in Christian Egypt, as of course elsewhere in the Christian world, was to represent the vital, healing presence of the saint him or herself. Toward that end, and as a social site, the shrine involved various media, attendants, and ritual performances to construct that presence. Iconography and the craftsmen who created it. Architecture to channel devotees' activities and create a sense of center. Texts and scribes for the collection of miracle stories, and hagiography for public reading. Shrine attendants to interpret the dreams of incubants and facilitate the placing of messages and votive offerings. Priests to devise and lead processions from around the shrine, and of course workshops to manufacture the souvenir vials and figurines so central to the pilgrim's experience in Christian Egypt. At the same time, the shrine as social site involved devotees, pilgrims, and the creative agency and traditions they inevitably brought to the shrine and its personnel. And out of this confluence of groups, attendants, and leaders, there arose at different saint shrines certain sanctioned forms of ritual interaction. Processions, incubation in some designated space near the shrine to get the saint's direct appearance in a dream, the removal of sand or oil as blessings in a souvenir vial, votive deposits near the central crypt, and most interesting for the study of syncretism in Christian Egypt, the submission of questions in positive and negative forms, as I described earlier, for the saint's divine choice. While every one of these forms of ritual interaction had pre-Christian precedents, it is meaningless to call them heathen survivals, for each one served as habitus, as a basic gesture in devotional interaction with a Christian shrine, whether by writing, sleep, or substance. What is instructive for the history of religions, I think, is the very elaborateness of such basic gestures. The repertoire of embodied customs for interacting with the sacred comprise not just hand positions and utterances, but sleep, as in this case, the phrasing of questions, and the positioning of dolls. Of course, the religious world of the saint shrine involved peripheral or unsanctioned forms of ritual interaction as well. There was animal slaughter and feasting, for example, and flirting, singing, and dancing. These modes of interaction with the shrine expressed the traditions and agency of the domestic world. And within and beyond Egypt, they earned the censure of purists like Shanuti of Atrupe. But the religious world of the shrine, especially at festival times, called forth these expressions and these responses. And people ate and danced and sang as part of the celebration of the saint. It may be obvious that the process of Christianization I'm describing does not fit entirely the dynamics of Pentecostalism or really Protestant missionizing itself, which have exerted very different forces on modern local cultures and in much more globalized contexts. My comparanda tend to come from the colonial Americas, but some anthropologists are retooling syncretism for broader application to religious transformations, and that's great. Essentially, syncretism lies not in recycling heathen ideas out of some uncatechized ignorance, but in the very acclamation of Christian power at a shrine or festival. So also with literate experts, syncretism lies in the practical use of Christian power through the efficacy of writing and the deployment of names. And so also with the domestic sphere, syncretism lies in the adjustment of Christian power for the exigencies of family life. And even with the holy man, syncretism lies in his prophetic definition of Christian power and in the local traditions of gesture through which he performs Christian power. Syncretism denotes the active, synthetic, and sometimes most problematic arena of religious transformation. As a category of analysis, it offers a lens on religious transformation, not an explanation. And fixing this lens on the various social sites in which Christianity was produced in late antique Egypt and beyond reveals a much more dynamic shared process than historians have classically imagined with notions of paganism, conversion, and survivals. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. So for those of you in the audience, we going to open up for questions now and discussion. If you would like to post a question, you can either type it into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand, click the raise hand feature, and we can call on you and unmute you. So I actually see a question right now from Catherine Bard, so let me actually unmute you and go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi, David. I'd like to ask you about the syncretism of burials in early Christian Egypt, which is something you didn't talk about, and which has a 3,000-year plus tradition of great importance in ancient Egypt.
Yeah. Yes, I could have done a whole lecture just on that because it's actually, the burial traditions are very, very complicated as more cemeteries are being excavated. What we find even in the 4th century is that you have entire cemeteries that seem to evoke, they're very simple burials. They don't have amulets on them. And some archaeologists think that the fact that they're buried east-west signifies a kind of engagement with Christian ideas. And then you find other burials, even in monasteries, where there are very elaborate corpse wrapping traditions and efforts to mummify the corpse and uses of amulets and even Christian scripture to protect the soul. And so in some ways the jury's out for how much we can generalize the various local engagements with old mummification traditions. And another big question is who is doing the more elaborate mummification acts. It's very complicated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next question we have here is from Doug Bafford.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for giving this presentation. And as an anthropologist, I can say that there was a lot of resonance with, I think, the way that we're thinking about syncretism and anti-syncretism. So I thought that kind of fit in nicely. And so it was nice having the kind of late antiquity perspective on the Christianization of Egypt. I wanted to ask a question of whether you could maybe expand on a point that you made rather early in the presentation, when I can't remember which community that you were talking about, but you were saying that I think perhaps in a contemporary sense that people are exaggerating these symbols and connections to an ancient religious practice. And so I think you were maybe talking about contemporary Coptic communities, but if not, feel free to correct me.
Yeah.
But I was interested in whether you could expand a little bit on what might be motivating these kinds of references back to earlier traditions. So in other words, like what is the kind of nostalgic appeal, or that appeal to, as you put it, tradition? How might that be playing either in contemporary Egyptian communities or perhaps even?
Oops, went out.
Sorry.
I lost it. I got the question. It's really interesting. So the places I've noticed this are, of course, modern Coptic Egypt, modern Greece since the 19th century at least, modern Ireland since the 19th century. So for one thing, this kind of nostalgic claim to be identified with a pre-Christian period seems to be part of what we would describe cross-culturally as nationalism, which is not not an ancient phenomenon, but very much a modern phenomenon where cultures become extremely self-conscious about their own claims to landscape, claims to antiquity, and what else would I say about it? It involves a kind of nationalistic archaeology, so that's an important part of this. And as I said, it's a very different, more self-conscious, more modern approach to pre-Christian antiquity, or one's culture's pre-Christian antiquity, than the kind of bricolage at the local level that I see going on, well, even through modernity, as I gave some examples, but where people, the emphasis is really on addressing domestic needs, or interconnecting, visiting shrines, things like that. I might call it kind of a folk syncretism or something like that, but this modern phenomenon of self-conscious nostalgic syncretism is different.
I see there's another question in the Q&A, but Doug, I'm sorry, I accidentally pressed the wrong button and cut you off early. So if there's something else you want to add, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself again.
No, I think that was pretty much it. And like I said, I think it's really fascinating to see this as kind of an expression of contemporary nationalism. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is here in the Q&A from John Herman. An observation: burial celebrations were as problematic for anti-syncretistic writers in Italy as saints' festivals. Paulinus of Nola, eventually they were all stamped out. I don't know if you want to...
Interesting, great. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions here?
I'll jump in with something. Yeah, David, thank you. That was very very interesting. As someone who is political scientist but tries to do religious studies on the side, I've been aware that we're not supposed to call things syncretism, but I don't know that I fully grasped sort of why. And now you explained that and then complicated it. So, could you talk about a little bit more? I mean, you've got into the sum, but a little bit more about how you think this helps us understand more contemporary situations. So for example, in Rwanda, people still use traditional rituals for burials. As much as the Catholic priests hate that they do, they continue to do it. What strikes me in particular, and what interests me is there are two things that happen in African Christianity today that I observe. One is the parallel practice of Christianity along with traditional rites, and the other is the mixing of the two. What's the appropriate language to talk about that, and how do you think sort of your observations about what is syncretism and what's not fit?
It's a real challenge, because the additional dimension, as I mentioned with nationalistic nostalgia, is the modern global context where people are thinking what is Catholicism, and thinking about Catholicism in this broad sense, and often thinking about African traditions too in a kind of Pan-African sense. And this is, I have a particular interest in Pentecostalism also as this issue, which in one sense is an extremely anti-traditional ideology. On the other hand, as you see it, as it's practiced in Africa, it involves all this traditional habitus. So these things are much more complicated. I guess what I would say is that syncretism, as the anthropologists would say, becomes an effort to articulate Christianity in local and meaningful terms, and that when you are maintaining burial practices that seem to be traditional, I think one thing that we are attuned to now is that that doesn't mean that those burial practices are exactly the burial practices of 200 years ago. They too are being reimagined and redefined in modern terms.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting for me. In Congo, there's a lot of complaints of the Pentecostals who are very opposed to witchcraft, but take it very seriously. So there's a lot of people who are thrown out of their homes, the street children who are, because they're seen as being possessed by witchcraft, right, or devil worship, and so this kind of interesting combination of, on the one hand, rejecting indigenous beliefs and spirits as evil while reinforcing them nonetheless.
It's difficult to. I think when you are making this distinction at the very local level, the family level, this is Christian, this is Native, or this is Zulu, or something like that, or in some cases, ethnographies have documented this is Muslim and this is Christian, and we're going to do them at different times. That's a very interesting phenomenon, and at some level, it does reflect indigenous agency, like families deciding, we can do this on the Muslim Saints' Day, and we can do this on the Catholic Day, and we'll do this for the benefit of our family. That's our motivation.
So we have another question here, a hand raised from our PhD candidate in history, Ethan Key. Ethan, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, I'm enjoying this talk, and I hope I'm not interrupting too much. I just wanted to say that this is kind of helping me think about religious interaction in a few different ways. First, I was just wanting to ask, like when you're referring to like Christians who refer to Isis, how does that relate to like something like what we know of like the mystery cult of Isis and like Apuleius's metamorphosis or golden ass? Then when you're like mentioning references to Nubianity or connections to the 20th century and even to the present between the Coptic Church in Alexandria and the Orthodox Tewahedo Church in Ethiopia. What were the connections like during this time period? Alexandria and the Kingdom of Aksum, and what were their connections to Nubia? Are those like, what languages are they using? Is it like Cushitic languages, or what's going on there? And then finally, did Christianity in Egypt kind of provide a pathway for how like Islam becomes incorporated into Egyptian worldviews, or is it like a very different process? I will be quiet now. Thank you.
The materials that mention ISIS in Christian texts don't have a lot to do with the representation of ISIS in classical texts like the Golden Ass by Apuleius. It's a very different world when that was written, and his experience of ISIS is very different from the text I opened up with, which really described ISIS as a kind of a native spirit, a local spirit who could be conjured in the context of a song. So I'll leave that. So the relationship between Egyptian Christianity and Sudanese Christianity, it seems to move through monastic circles and through, of course, different peoples and kings would adopt Christianity, and this is what the archaeology of Nubia is showing. I have not studied the Christianization of Ethiopia. That also came down to kings, and the reason I look to Ethiopia is for a particular social role on the periphery of the Ethiopian church, or actually the choristers. This figure, the Debtera, who is broadly viewed as being able to write out healing scrolls and also control demons and angels and things like that. And so it gives us a good comparandum for understanding the role of monks and the role of various lower scribes in Egypt to write out these magical texts in Egypt. Did Christianity provide a kind of route for Islam? Probably. There's a new book that's just about to come out, which suggests that Muslim leaders had great respect for Christian monks and saw their kind of ethical living as exemplary. But of course, this doesn't really fit so much with Ethiopia. It's a very interesting historical question. Very interesting historical question.
Thank you, Ethan. So we have another hand. We have a couple hands up, and then we also have some written questions. So I'm going to go, I think, in order of how they came in. The next one here is Manu Radhakrishnan. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Hello, David.
Hi, Manu.
Thank you for showing Onufrius. I was very pleased to see him next to Macarius there.
Okay.
But my question is this about the survivals of so-called pagan forms, and I was thinking about Augustine's mother Monica coming to Milan and her interactions with Ambrose, or her being told that the practice of bringing food to the martyrs' graves, which seemed completely fine in the North African Christianity that she was used to, was actually not permissible in Milan. So because it's seen as too close to pre-Christian heathen religion, so to speak. So how does this fit into your model? And I'm just wondering whether, because clearly Monica thought of herself as completely Christian, and that there was nothing that she was doing was superstitious or somehow related to pre-Christian practices. But from Ambrose's point of view, that was the case.
Right. In some ways, your example completely fits with what I'm talking about, because it's a local or regional tradition of interaction with saint shrines, bringing food, as you say, to shrines in one area. It's viewed as inappropriate in another one. The rhetoric of what we might call an anti-syncretistic rhetoric arises. You're saying Ambrose is the one who said it was heathen, yes?
Yes, and in fact, I think there was some employee at the graveyard who basically said, no, you can't bring you can't bring food to the martyrs' graves. So there was someone who checked, and she so she wasn't allowed to do that. But Augustine then talks about her willingness to adapt to these new to these new conditions.
Right, which we might say, oh, how nice for her to adapt, but it also means that her own home traditions are now being obliterated in favor of this more purist Christianity. I mean, one of the interesting things that, to me, is whether Ambrose would actually has a kind of long-standing association between food offerings at martyrs' graves and particular memories of Italian temple practices, or whether it's just not done. It's just not appropriate. And so he brings out the term paganus or something like that to label it as inappropriate in this particular way. It's a heathen practice. It's not just inappropriate. It's a heathen practice. I think you have exactly this kind of thing today when pilgrims come to Jerusalem from all over the Mediterranean, and they do all kinds of things that they would very, very happily do at local shrines in Italy or Greece or Macedonia, and they arrive in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and someone says, get up off the floor, you can't do that. Now, they may not say that's a heathen practice because they're not so close to traditional religion. They might say, we don't do that here. You can't burst into tears or you can't sing, or you can't make this much noise in this shrine. There's a lot of policing that goes on at saint shrines.
Right, but I think that's different from saying this particular practice causes us anxiety because it's too close to something that we consider pagan or superstitious or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Which is a rhetorical move.
I think you can have an etiquette, which is simply, this is how you behave here, and saying, no, this practice that seems fine to you is actually not fine.
Right.
But the reason being that, we consider it
heathen,
extra Christian, heathen.
I would say that in the first 3 centuries after Constantine, that people were very acutely anxious about that kind of appearance, those kinds of memories, and that also the rhetoric of anti-syncretism, of anti-heathenism was probably more popular among ecclesiastical forces at that time. Later on, it's just etiquette. But at that point, etiquette translated into anti-syncretism. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Great analogy.
Great. So the next, we had 2 questions actually coming from John Herman here in the Q&A box. First, just sort of a question, isn't Egypt atypical in its use of statuettes? And relatedly, and that came in a little bit earlier, I think, when you were answering a previous question. And then another question here from him, is there a specific ancient god lurking behind the Shay that you referred to?
It's a point of discussion right now about Egypt's figurines. There were massive figurine workshops in Syria and Palestine. We have all kinds of clay things coming from shrines in the Middle East, but people say that maybe the fact that we have so many of these figurines during the Christian period is luck of dusty deserts, of the preservation. I tend to suspect that what we have in Egypt is roughly representative of what you'd get anywhere in the Mediterranean and Western Europe as well, where there were iconic traditions or old iconic traditions. In other places, they would have carved wood, and we do still have some carved wood figurines from the medieval periods, or bone. With Egypt, you do have a long tradition of potteries that created very effective images, but I do think that Egypt is representative in this regard rather than unique. And what was the other question? It was about
It was about whether there was an ancient god lurking behind the Shay that you referred to.
Oh, the Shai. Yeah, the Shai is a god of fortune. It's equivalent to Tuke or Agathos Daimon, which was one of the principal kind of guardian spirits of Alexandria. And that Agathos Daimon Shai goes back at least to Ptolemaic Egypt.
Great. So we have another question here from Catherine Bard. We allow you to speak. There you go, Catherine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'd just like to say that in terms of Ethiopia, a king Ezana in the early 4th century was the first to convert to Christianity, and then we begin to see crosses on the coins. However, in the material culture, where I've excavated just to the north of the center of Aksum on Beta Georgis Hill, we don't see crosses used as symbols in the material culture until about 2 centuries later. So it seems to me as if that there was a top-down process of Christianization in Ethiopian culture.
Thank you for that. The whole history of the use of the cross is so interesting by itself, because it's very much the production of craftsmen and workshops, and it's also the use of the cross has a very effective kind of imperial or royal function, as well as an exorcistic function. And the other thing I keep wondering, in terms of this, the term top down always requires that at some point it moves from the top to the bottom. And this is where my methodology is trying to, this is what I'm trying to address with this methodology, that at some point a discourse or a symbolic system that is very much at home, integrated into royal culture or military culture or ecclesiastical culture, how does it move, quote unquote, to the village, to the family, to the region? And this is where I need to have some model of agency, because otherwise the only models are coercion or conversion, which is a very, very Protestant notion that tends to reflect kind of pre-critical notions of people becoming a different religion. So I think that, you know, even with top-down, in many of the culture, much of the Christianization that happened in the Mediterranean and Western Europe, we could call it top-down, but the big question is, what is that down dynamic? What goes on there?
That's really problematic.
Yeah, what do you mean?
But the processes involved.
Yeah. No, it's right. Yeah.
And especially when you just have material culture and not a lot of textual information about the ideas behind the material culture, then it's difficult to deal with.
Yeah, no, it's true. Thank you.
So we had a couple written sort of comments from Annevis van den Hoek, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. But in addition to the question about Ambrose and Monica, she also liked wine a lot, which may have disturbed the situation. I believe those are two separate comments, but I believe those are linked. I don't know if you want to respond to that at all.
Say it again.
In addition to the question about Ambrose and Monica, she also liked the wine a lot, which may have disturbed the situation.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there are certain criticisms of behavior at saint shrines that keep coming up, and they keep coming up not always with accusations of heathenism or residual heathenism, but they involve women being overly flirtatious and dancing and drunkenness as well. So thank you, Annevis. Yes, I mean, so these become things that people do at saint shrines because they make sense, because this is how you celebrate a saint. And the ecclesiastical overseers and abbots say that this you should not be doing this. Do this at home if you want to, but don't do it at a Christian site. sometimes these ecclesiastical figures or monastic figures draw on a rhetoric of anti-heathenism. Sometimes they just say this is just inappropriate activity.
Okay, and then we have a question here from Tim Weiskull. Tim, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. I'm just curious about the more general problem in Africa of a syncretism with different kinds of cults and this kind of syncretistic behavior and religious activity. There's a very strong movement in the early colonial Ivory Coast of it looks like a religious church that emerges around a fellow named Harris. It's Harrism, it's called, and it has all the accoutrements of an ecclesiastical representation with bishops in white robes, and they show up in the statuary tradition as well. Carvings of what were long thought to be Western missionaries, but in fact are probably carvings of African priests in the Harris Church. But I'm curious because along all of this raises the intercultural component as well as a technological component. You have with Islam and Christianity two literate traditions encountering one another. But in the Ivory Coast at this point, you had basically one literate tradition encountering non-literate cultures. And in fact, white men are referred to in the Baoulé language as blofwe. Blofwe means people of paper. And the act and fact of being able to read, write, and send telegrams is actually very important in terms of what's perceived of as a new kind of power. Whites are thought to have power because they can read paper. And they're called paper people for that reason, blofwe. The then intervening group that emerges with all the accoutrements of a church ecclesial apparatus, being the people of the book and being able to read paper and say it means this, it is a very interesting asymmetry of power, because it's a black group that's emerging with robes saying that they can read paper, and interpreting the meaning of that to people who neither have writing nor the capacity to understand the narrative behind the writing, in the sense that they don't know the saints and everything else. So that the whole apparatus, in a sense, is presented as a kind of new power structure that they are being invited to learn about. And in the process, if they learn about it, there are new advantages. For example, they can find employment, or they can be deferentially regarded in the marketplace, or they can be given particular tasks by the administrative authorities in the area because they're trusted or whatever. In other words, the whole asymmetry of power arriving at the same time as the asymmetry of technology, paper, and at the same time as the intercultural component of one culture trying to, in effect, interpret itself to another, seems to me quite interesting as a thing to pursue, but quite different, perhaps, from the conversion process occurring in Egypt between two illiterate traditions. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'd love to hear them.
It's really interesting, and we do see elements of this in Christianization of the Mediterranean. I mean, it's interesting that you put it in terms of a disequilibrium of power being kind of negotiated through this new technology of writing and the book and paper. Because in many ways, okay, this is a kind of new religious movement in Ivory Coast. You find this, I think, at the village level and at the workshop level all over the early Christian world, where people presented with the perhaps military dominance or royal dominance of Christianity, kind of appropriate that dominance through either new technologies like the book or the image of the book, or else native technologies, making a cross or making an image of Jesus and his mother in more traditional iconographic forms. I will say that some of the most interesting work on the promulgation of amulets made out of scripture, of Christian scripture, reflects a view of the Bible as a book, or the book itself as being a particularly unusual vehicle of power. And so there have been found these, well, we have miniature books from Egypt, little tiny books that were used as often as amulets, but also bronze amulets, or maybe they're gold amulets of books from the northern territories, from Scandinavia. Which means that people were thinking about the book as presented by bishops as having this kind of autonomous power, irrespective of what's actually in the book. So I like your example because it shows how, how the local perspective on the technology of writing in the book can be very creative and very useful in redefining what writing, what book, what paper, what message means. We kind of assume these things, but it takes looking at local culture's reception of literacy that we can see it in a different light. And Jack Goody, obviously, and Walter Ong had much to say about these phenomena too.
Well, Jack was one of the examiners of my thesis, and he was interested in this aspect of things as well. And in fact, it was that which seems to be confused in a lot of these cultures I was looking at in the early 20th century, where writing was both crucial to civil authorities and to religious authorities. Mm-hmm. And the written word from the commandant, the local, as they call themselves, les petits rois de la brousse, that is the little district officer, was put forward with the same attribute of power and solemnity and importance when he was reading from an official government document, just as when the missionaries were reading from their book. Mm-hmm. This is why the notion of paper is so interesting and in effect translatable back and forth between whites in the church and whites in the administration. Anyway, right. It's a very interesting theme to pursue, but I think in a sense the iconography is not just the crosses and the saints and figurines, which are very crucial in this area, and in other parts of West Africa. The figurines carved of the saints and of Mary and of Jesus are actually very important in Yoruba art, for example. Mm-hmm. But that's different from, in a sense, the power of the written word. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. I have one here in the Q&A from Anna Rogozina. Thank you very much for the presentation, David. What is your view on the phenomenon of the relics of the saints, in particular the saints' bodies, which get their own following and become, in a way, a problem that Chanute refers to in one of his homilies when people drag random bones into churches and claim that these are relics of a martyr who appeared to me in a dream and told me to build a martyrion for his remnants? Would you say that this is a foreign or purely Christian element, or can we find some precursor to this phenomenon?
Well, I wouldn't. Hi, Anna. We're not going to find a foreign or pre-Christian part of this, but it is a premier example of what I call local agency. So given or presented with the discourse of martyrs' bones and relics and martyrologies and martyr legends, local communities discover invent, I guess is the proper word, new bones. You know, you go digging and you find bones and you say, this fits in with the stories we've been telling about this particular saint who made it here. And so bracketing Shenoudi's perspective on this particular phenomenon, we see people are saying, you know, we have found the bones, we have located a martyr, we have given materiality to the stories we have been telling, and we want a shrine built here. Shenoudi, of course, is both very involved with the martyr cult and also very critical of what he would call excesses. But I think that this particular text that you're referring to is a really valuable example of what people want to do, how they want to engage with the idea of martyrs' relics. I mean, you get the same thing actually in the Life of Saint Martin of Tours, where it kind of makes fun of people who sanction the bones of a robber in order to, and they bring offerings there, and Sulpicius Severus kind of makes fun of people who would do something so crazy as to worship the bones of a robber. But people were very involved at the local level with the cult of martyrs.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been a fantastic presentation and a fantastic conversation. Lots of great questions here. Thank you all so much.
That was great, David, and good to see you had fans from around the world joining in.
Good. Well, thanks a lot, and see you guys around.